So for those of you that don't know Byron, he's originally from Australia, so he's familiar with sandpaper.
Yes.
He's worked for leading Australian trainer like Bridges and a bookmaker. He spent time at Coolmore in Ireland and at Paul Coles' training yard before he travelled to Hong Kong to work for some top trainers. He spent 8 years with Arrowfield in Australia as stallion nominations and bloodstock manager, part of the team that developed the careers of leading sires Reduce's Choice, Flying Spur, Danzera, Husinay, as well as planning the matings for leading racehorses such as Miss Finland, Mentality, Alberta, and many others. He extended his industry experience at TaylorMade Farm in Kentucky, so he and Scott know each other.
Who's Scott?
He was there for 3 years as the director of the stallion division. And then in 2008, he went back to Australia as the national sales manager for William Inglis & Son, and that's Australia's leading thoroughbred sales company. In 2009, he became managing partner of Pedigree Consultants, which co-owned and developed Trunix. In 2011, he launched the Thoroughbred Genetics Company, and that's what the second talk will be on, which uses the latest in genetic and phenotypic research and techniques to identify elite thoroughbreds and breeding stock. I'll hand you over to Brian Rodgers.
That was a hell of an introduction. Thank you very much. Well, my first slide was actually what I did, but James said it was about as best as I could do. You know, I don't need to be telling you exactly what I did, but yeah, that's all up there. The one thing that we worthwhile mentioning is the co-creation of Trunix with Alan Porter and the Blood Horse, and obviously now the Jockey Club in America having bought half of the Blood Horse owned part of Trunix. So what I'll briefly discuss, we'll talk about thoroughbred nicking and the development of Trunix and how we came about it, how Trunix ratings are calculated and how they work, and what are sort of some of the pros and cons for all of that. We'll also talk about the key ancestors, how we developed a slightly different way of looking at horses, pedigrees, and Trunix 2.0, which is actually something we're working on right now, which will be hopefully ready to go later this year. So pedigree analysis actually is pretty much unchanged up until the 1980s. What guys like Tessio did with the split books and stuff like that is what we used to do up until the mid-1980s, to when guys had sort of started bringing in computing power into looking at how pedigrees were constructed. One of the first actually to do that was the man sitting right here with Charles Fall. They were one of the first guys to really sort of get into bringing into a database the pedigree structure. Equine Line in America and Aryan pedigrees in New Zealand were also at the forefront. But as a general rule, the thoroughbred industry has been very, very late relative to other breeds, and it was touched on earlier about what other breeds are doing in terms of animal species like pigs and cattle and sheep. We haven't really sort of brought in technology for statistical analysis, and we haven't used it for genomic analysis as much as we possibly could. One of the reasons was that computing power was not able to process the amount of foals that were born every year worldwide. So that was a limiting factor, but that's obviously changed now. We've got cloud computing and the computing power, like literally what takes seconds now is milliseconds. And that was one of the things that limited Trunix when we first started. We had to deliver something within 3 seconds. So the limitation of what we gathered and how we did the calculations when we did this, because Trunix was actually built 10 years ago, turned out to be quite a limiting factor, and one that we do now want to change. The concept of a genetic affinity between two ancestors in the pedigree has been around for a long time. Dr. Osmer, back in the 1756, first wrote about genetic affinities between the racehorses. Some of the most popular nicks have certainly shaped the breed, and we see them all the way through. We'll give you a few examples here. A lot of it was initially just based on observation. So breeders were breeding certain ways to do certain things. So to have a mare by lots of mares, obviously the early breeders were very much didn't travel mares and travel stallions as far as they do now, and so a lot of the matings or nicks occurred purely because the same quality of mares were on the certain quality of mares by certain stallions were there, and a stallion would arrive at that time that suited that broodmare sire. But technology has certainly changed pedigree analysis and changed the way that we think about matings. First of all, Jack Work back in the late 80s started looking at computerised population of stakes winners, and he just used stakes winning population only. He never used all foals, he didn't use runners or anything like that, he just looked at stakes winners. And then we at Trunix, we came along and we looked with the Jockey Club, and we came up with Trunix to look at actually how many times something had been tried and actually how many times it had been successful. So looking at all foals, all runners and stakes winners, and compared that to all foals when bred to, all the mares when bred to other stallions, and the sire when bred to other mares by a different broodmare sire, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So the skill now is actually interpreting the relevant data, and I'll say this probably about 3 times in this talk. Paper does not run fast. You've got to, when you're doing any of these matings, is you must have a common sense approach to what your mare actually needs. I can stand up here and we can talk about all the statistics and all the numbers, but paper does not run fast. So you do not ever lose sight of the fact that you are trying to breed an athlete. And sometimes what you're trying to breed and what you're trying to breed. So if you're trying to breed a horse and you say, I'm trying to sell this horse, that is sometimes antagonistic to actually breeding a racehorse that can run. So sometimes those horses that you'll see in sales rings are all what we call all dressed up with nowhere to go. They look great on physical tights, but actually they're not actually bred to be a proper racehorse. The pedigree page, a 5 cross or further, defines the hypothetical possibility of an art, but the art or science of what might happen. So way back when, this is the sort of one of the earlier nicks that in the breed was the Sons of Eclipse with mares by Herod. Then you look at the horses through the late 1700s and early 1800s was Derby winners and Oaks winners and St Ledger winners and that sort of stuff. So it's been around for a long time, the history of nicking, and unfortunately that's not a very good, you can't really sort of see, but that is Secretariat on the left-hand side there, and he's by a son of Nasrallah out of mare by Prince Quillo, and you have Milroof, who won the Epsom Derby, and he is also by a son of Nasrallah out of a mare by Prince Quillo. So you see throughout history that there's been nicks that have been used for different purposes. Obviously Secretariat are fairly much a dirt-dominated stallion, yet you still have a horse like Milroof who won the Epsom Derby. We also see it quite a lot in reverse. On the left-hand side there you see High Chaparral, who is by Saddler's Wells out of a mare by Darshan. And then on the other side there, Conduit, who's a Grade 1 winner, Group 1 winner, he is by a son of Darshan out of a Saddler's Wells mare. So we do see that. We are actually, as part of this talk and also part of the next talk, I'll start to talk about exactly why that occurs and how that occurs. And there's a man sitting over there that asked me a question earlier on, and we'll get to that. But just be aware that they do actually, there's enough data, they do actually occur in different pattern. This is one of the more famous negative nicks. Obviously Bold Ruler was a great stallion, stood at Claiborne stud, and Claiborne sent a ton of Bold Ruler mares to Buck Passer when he retired off the track to Claiborne as well. So he had 33 foals, he had over 50 mares bred to him, he had 33 foals but only had 2 stakes winners. Buck Passer, when he was bred to every other broodmare sire line but Bold Ruler, was 14%, and Bold Ruler, those Bold Ruler mares when bred to all other sires was 9%. So you get an example of a really a negative nick. And then obviously here is a positive one in APND with Mr. Prospector mares, one of the more common modern day nicks. 20 stakes winners from 121 foals, and APND is 11% stakes winners for foals with all other broodmare sires. So he's still a good stallion, but he's better with Mr. Prospector mares, and Mr. Prospector as a broodmare sire is 7% stakes winners without APND. So that's how the calculation works. The first thing we look at is we look at the percentage of cross between Nasrallah, say, and Prince Quillo. We calculate the percentage of stakes winners to starters for all other mares bred to Nasrallah, and then we calculate the percentage of stakes winners to starters for all those Prince Quillo mares when bred to every single other stallion. So we're looking at true opportunity. The variance score as a calculation is a multiplication of the sire side and the broodmare sire side, and it's non-linear. So what happens is when we have a small sample set, we get these high scores. You'll see them when you run Trunix ratings. You'll see these things that are in the 500s and stuff like that. That is literally because, we'll go through the rules here in a second, because of the fact that you will have a small population of mares who have produced stakes winners at an inordinate amount, and they're out of different mares. So for example, very early on, one of the stallions, Distorted Humour, had 3 foals out of El Prado mares, and 2 of them are graded stakes winners. So we actually calculated that, and the reason we did that is we talked to the guys at the Gluck University, Ernie Bailey and his team. They referred us to a couple of population geneticists, one of which is Max Rothschild, who was mentioned earlier on, and they talked about the fact that it is statistically significant from the fact if you have 2 mares by a particular broodmare sire and each of those individual mares has a stakes winner by another stallion, then that is actually a true rating, a nick rate, or should be created as a nick rating. This is the distribution of sort of the ratings of how they occur. The B plus or better is about 13% of the entire population, but it is about 37% of all stakes winners. The C, Ds and Fs are about 44% of the entire population, and they're about 8% of the stakes winners. So we do get lowly rated horses that are stakes winners, and I'll explain where we messed up. We made a mistake, and I'm going to show you. So Trunix is built on a set of rules. We have to have at least 15 runners bred on the rule calculation, with 1 stakes winner on the sire side and 1 stakes winner on the broodmare sire side for the calculation to actually take place. So obviously that's why we require a lot of data from around the world to make these sort of calculations. The only exception is that Distorted Humour exception. If there's a stakes winner of 2 unique mares by the same broodmare sire, example Distorted Humour with El Prado mares, we make that calculation, and that usually results in the very high variance scores you see. If the program runs through all the calculations and cannot gather 15, so occasionally we get these, and sometimes here in South Africa we see it, there's what we call very thin sire lines. Like you've got a stallion who hasn't served a lot of mares, and he has a son that goes to start and he doesn't serve a lot of mares, and you have a very thin line. That'll get through the rules very quickly and get itself out to 15 runners, and we don't have any data to support either say it's good or bad, so that'll come up with a no rating. So this is how the rating works. We have a look at Group A, the sire, and that's the first calculation. The first rule is to look at the sire and the broodmare sire, see if that's got enough numbers. We go then to the sire, the broodmare sire, sons and grandsons, and we work our way back through the pedigree, right back to the Rule 16, which is the grandsire of the sire, sons and grandsons, with grandsire, the broodmare sire, sons and grandsons. So there's always it's sort of a sequential calculation that we have to make each time. Each time it's gathering the data worldwide, so it's moving very quickly to gather enough data. If you think about the Jockey Club database, they're gathering data from everywhere: South Africa, Australia, Japan, everywhere, and North America, all through Europe. So we calculate it, we move very quickly across a lot of data, and that was also a vice as opposed to the virtue of just doing the calculation itself. We do have what's called face-offs, and the reason we have these is because at certain points in time, they're generationally the same. So if you look at the example here, if I can point to it, AP India's in the first generation of the sire, and a Razor Native there. That calculation generationally is the same as that and that. So, so what we do there is we actually calculate both of them at once, and then we work out which one's closest to. We do a log of that, and we work out which is closest to 1, because we actually want the most relevant to the mating at hand. So there are a few face-offs which I'll actually discuss in a minute that we go through as we're working our way through the data set. So if we look at ratings, one of the criticisms that we have is that they do change. And that's the reason is that the most times they change in January, and the reason they change a bit in January is because they get flooded with Northern Hemisphere foals. So the database doesn't add foals until or 2-year-olds until they turn 2, basically. So all those horses that are yearlings, and when they turn 2 in the Northern Hemisphere, we get a whole stack of data coming in all at once, and some of those will change. But they tend to settle down. We actually took 20 proven sires, both good and bad. We took Smarty Jones and a whole bunch of different ones that were bad and good ones like APND. And we went through and we sort of followed them. We did the ratings about what their original rating was and what their rating was as a 2-year-old when they were about to race, and then what they ended up being in terms of their outcomes. And there was a bit of change here and there, but probably not as much as as you would think. The general population, if you look at those things in red there, there wasn't too much of a change. They sort of just flipped. Few of them flipped here, 5% here, 4% down. So that was sort of a flip there, and there's a sort of change there as well between C's and C pluses. But what did happen here was the interesting one was that the stakes winners changed. And we went back and started to look at that. And what happens is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So people tend to breed back to those high rating, so if you've got a proven sire with, say, APND with Mr. Prospector, it gets tried an inordinate amount of times, but because of the class of the APND mare, the Mr. Prospector mare that's going to APND, you still get that production of stakes winners. It's like what's going on with Galileo right now in Danehill. There's a lot of Danehill mares going to Galileo, but they are high-class Danehill mares, so the production of that cross doesn't drop off like it normally would because of the fact of the racing class, the production class of those mares. So that was quite an interesting finding that you basically, over a period of time, these proven sires can hold a nick for a long period of time. So if you've got, I don't know, a stallion here, let's just Captain Hour with Jetmaster mares or something like that, that will hold for a longer period of time than most of the other nick ratings. So in proven sires, once you find one that's a positive nick for that stallion, abuse it. Use it as much as you possibly can. The rules themselves had a little variation. There was one little interesting one here, was the rule between Rule 3, which is a very small percentage of the population, Rule 6, which is a very small percentage of the population. That's actually a face-off. That had a funny distribution to it. We haven't quite worked out why that has that funny distribution to it, but the rest of it was pretty straightforward as to what they do. The other thing we sort of do a couple of years ago was we recognised we had people ringing us up saying, oh, you're only looking at the sire and the broodmare sire line and you should be looking at more. And at that stage we couldn't. But that changed probably about 3 years ago. The Jockey Club changed their way that their database is built. So they took it over to an SQL database, and so we could do a heap more with it, and we still are trying to do a lot more. And so what we did was we did the key ancestor report, and Ian Tapp, who spoke out here a few years ago, he was one of the guys that really sort of came up with this idea with Alan Porter. And what it does is it looks at the entire pedigree. So we actually took it away and said, let's look at everything. Let's look at it all back to 6 generations in a pedigree page and actually come up with something that it's meaningful. Is it meaningful to inbreed to Leyland, or is it Al Mahmood, or any of these mares or whatever? What does it actually mean? So we did that. We went back and looked at that, and how we did it was we took your mare. So let's say we take a mare like Black Caviar, and we take that mare and we look at gathering as many mares as we possibly can that are closely related to Black Caviar. So we'll take mares by the same side, and mares that are out of the same female families, mares that are by the same broodmare sire, all those sorts of things. And we gather them in a large group and we grade them. We do a coefficient of relatedness, which is basically a calculation, like an inbreeding calculation, but a calculation of how related that first mare was to Black Caviar is to all these other mares that are by the same sire. And we gather 500, we gather as many mares as we possibly can. We have a cut-off at 15%, basically, if they're not that closely related. If you can imagine that if they're full sisters, they're 50% related in terms of coefficient of relatedness. And then we do is once we've gathered those mares, we look at the offspring of those foals, of those mares, I should say. What are those foals, the foals out of those mares that are closely related to black caviar? What have they done on the racetrack? And what ancestors within the first 6 generations of those foals are actually meaningful or meaningless? So the most positive and negative ancestors. So here's a mare here, Dane Dream. She was a Lamitas mare. This is sort of a rough working of the key ancestor report. There's 165 mares there that were related in some way, the average relatedness and the median. And these were, so this mare here was related to her, and we just, that was one of her superior runners, and we go through and we sort of work out all the superior runners. So this is how related all these mares are to Dane Dream. And this is and this gives you an idea there also as to what sire lines that they've been to and that sort of stuff, and what stallions have worked with that particular mare. But the key to it is actually what it does is it looks at it all and weights everything per generation. So the further you go back into a pedigree, we weight everything and sort of work out what are important ancestors, positive ancestors for Dane Dream, i.e. mares that are bred similar to her. What aspects of the pedigree have actually been positive, and then what she should avoid. So when mares that are bred the same way as Dane Dream, those foals, those offspring that have been bad, like had 3 or more starts and couldn't beat John Costa down a hill, we get those as well. So that's how the sort of key ancestor report works, and that's where we sort of took things. Here was the biggest deficiency, and this is the choice we made, which I wish we didn't have to make, but we did at the time. We thought we were doing the right thing. Class. Class is unbelievably important. We didn't consider class there because we couldn't make the calculation, because we had to produce the report within a certain period of time. We couldn't consider racing class, and it was a big mistake we made at the time, and one we're trying to fix right now. So when you consider those horses that were derated that turned out to be good horses, 8 of the 9 of them, or almost 80-90% of them, were out of stakes winning mares. So those lowly rated deratings that we were like, these are not going to turn out to, they were actually out of poor race mares, and they were the ones that actually turned out to be stakes winners. So we underestimated the importance of racing class, which I talk about in the second talk. The other thing, obviously, was the computing power has increased significantly. So what we could have done, couldn't do a decade ago, we can easily do now. So we're going to start to expand on the key ancestors report. We're actually going to go back further generations. We're going to start to look at a lot of stuff. So calculations can certainly make differently now, and that's one of the things we are doing. So we can actually use machine learning and artificial intelligence to look deeper into a pedigree and weigh the 3 aspects of the pedigree page a lot better. If we talk about those individually, how the pedigree is constructed, so just basically names on the page. Like if you take the 6 cross and you just said these are the names of the page, we can look at how that's constructed. How that pedigree construction is performed in terms of apianity with Mr. Prospector mares and various things like that, how that sire and broodmare sire line is performed, and even go deeper into the pedigree. Although when we talk about it in our second talk, we wonder how important that actually is. And what is the level of racing and the production performance of the immediate ancestors. So the sire, we've done a study on which I'll talk about, is the sire and the dam and the immediate grandparents are key indicators of what you're going to get. You can't make stuff up that's not there. So just be aware of that. This was an interesting paper that actually only just came out, when did it come out? April 18th, so not long ago. This guy here, Brandon Bailey, is on the International Studbook Committee Advisory Council for Genetics. Natasha Hamilton, who runs the Studbook Genotyping in Australia. This is a paper that they put together. They looked at 127,000 horses, and they took them back. They got the Australian Studbook records, and they took them back as far as they could possibly do. If you've got a chance to read this, it's quite an interesting paper, but I'll show you what they did. So there's 2 measures that they use. One was called an inbreeding, Wright's F coefficient, which is an inbreeding coefficient calculation. Fairly straightforward, easy to do. You'll see that on the Trunix papers. So like if you look at the the enhanced report, right down the bottom of the enhanced report on the first page, we put the inbreeding coefficient. The inbreeding coefficient itself had a negative relationship to all the measures that they used. Cumulative earnings, being too inbred was no good. Earnings per start, nothing, so being too inbred. The other interesting one that they used was what's called an ancestor drop. That's a calculation which we don't have, which I'm actually trying to get introduced into Trunix. An ancestor drop works on the basis that every generation that we breed a horse, the ancestors that are bad don't make the next generation. Who's a really bad stallion here like 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Yeah.
Here.
Argonaut.
I was going to mention him. I was going to be polite, and then that's why I sent it to him, I knew exactly what he was going to do. So how many Argonaut mares are in the population? So when you actually go now and look at the pedigree pages of yearlings, you don't see, one of the worst stallions, I was at Arrowfield, one of the worst stallions we ever had was Catrail. He was evil. I'm telling you, you went into a paddock with him, he'd want to kill you. His progeny were evil. They were just bad horses with bad attitudes. He was a son of Storm Cat. They used to, I went to Newmarket to see him, and he was trained at Haggis's had him, and they used to have to take a stock whip to get him on the friggin', on the gallops. He was just a bad horse. Well, you don't see him in a pedigree anymore. You go into yearling sales and they disappear. And that's what this pedigree drop works like. And what it does is basically over a period of generations, it drops out. The names that aren't good drop out, and the ones that are keep going. And so what they ended up finding, which I'll go on to the next one here, was these were the horses right back in the start of time, basically, that had some influence, both positive and negative, to racing outcomes. And I'll show you, so you've got Herod and Eclipse and St Simon and the Godolphin Arabian and Touchstone and all those sorts of stuff. And here's what they were. So if you take a stallion like Herod, he had a positive influence on cumulative earnings. So more Herod blood is actually a positive thing, and then you've got Eclipse and you've got St Simon. They're probably statistically not really significant, those two ones. The negative was Touchstone. Well, he was out of a mare who was Aurora. His mother was Aurora, so he was probably a negative for the breed, Touchstone. And so all these stallions just sort of go through, these were the ones that they identified and how they influenced the pedigrees. And so this is the sort of stuff we're trying to develop into Trunix. The next version of Trunix is to try to get something that considers the whole pedigree, considers it right back, and we can tie racehorse performance into it. So that's where the other thing is, we're going to look at making them into traits. So rather than one rating, so you have an A-rated horse or something like that, or a B plus or something like that, we want to build them into actual traits. Because people have different versions of what they're trying to do. People are trying to breed a elite sprinter, or they're trying to breed a middle distance horse, or they're trying to breed a long distance horse, they're trying to breed one on dirt. I'll say it again in the second talk, there's a huge difference between JJ the Jet Plane, American Pharaoh and Yates. They're three different horses, and people have with different pedigree structures, you're trying to achieve different things. So that's what we're trying to do. We will actually start to give you a percentage probability of an outcome rather than just one rating. So it'll be a percentage chance of being a certain thing. And then obviously it'll also consider the life cycle of horses. Basically most good racehorses mature at about 4.5, 5, 6, that sort of stuff. So we'll start to look at that that's where we're developing Trunix, and that's what we're trying to do in terms of optimising and getting tools these tools that'll help you breed a more consistent racehorse and focus what you're trying to do. From the stallion owner's viewpoint, because I know there's a couple of stallion owners here who are already subscribed to Trunix and have their stallions subscribed to Trunix, one of the things that's going to happen is that it is actually going to go onto the Equine Line website, on Equine Line 5 Cross, so that'll happen, I think it's happening next Monday. So instead of it just being on the Trunix site, it'll now go on the Jockey Club website, and that we run about 1.7 million nicks a year. The free 5 Cross on the Jockey Club does about 6.5 million. So you'll get massive exposure with the Trunix rating on that service. And so that's where we're heading off to.